Happy May, everybody. Of course, it's not an especially happy May, is it? To my, I don't want to say surprise because nothing really surprises me with the Japanese government and their travel bans anymore, but I guess to my disappointment and let's just say to the contrary of logic and reason, it seems that the April 1st start of the Japanese school year has had no impact whatsoever on allowing students, for their part, into the country, and then flowing from that, workers and romantic partners. And I guess broadly speaking, as I've been thinking about this the past couple of weeks, there was really only two possibilities for Japanese officials and for the Japanese government as a collective. There's the possibility that they're ignorant, that they're hapless, that they don't know what they're doing. And I think that's the case for a lot of the individual politicians. Certainly, they always have that deer in the headlights look when they're on camera, and even in their native language, sound like fools. But then I think there are also people who genuinely don't care um, if foreigners are allowed back into the country. Some of them because they doubt the value of the international education sector. They don't think that immigrants actually contribute more to Japan commercially than they take in benefits. And then I think that there are some people who are genuine racists. There's this politician. I thought she was just some troll, but it turns out she's a politician. Her name is Kotoe Hashimoto. And she's on Twitter literally talking about this crackpot theory she has that only foreigners can get and spread COVID, and that every COVID case that has occurred in Japan has been in a foreigner, and that Japanese people are somehow impervious to this. And, strangely, Twitter Japan has not banned her. They've not taken down any of her tweets. They've not tagged them as misinformation. And while the good news is I don't think her viewpoint on this subject is mainstream or popular, it's evidently not that too far out there. I mean, I was talking to one of my friends yesterday. He's from France. And I was like, can you imagine if Marine Le Pen, the furthest right national figure in France, were to say that Muslims had brought COVID in from the Middle East, and that if we just got rid of all Muslims, COVID would be gone. I mean, it would be front page news. There would be calls for her to, well, I don't think she holds any position. I was going to say if she holds a position, there would be calls for her to resign. It would be a national outrage, as it should be. Yet here in Japan, nobody really cares when people say things like that. And then there's also a government minister, someone in the national government. I want to say it was Taro-san, the minister in charge of vaccines, but it might have been someone else. I don't remember who it was, and unfortunately, I was doing a search before I made this video, and I couldn't remember where I'd seen it. But someone very high up in the government's virus response essentially said, yes, all of our current clusters can be traced to foreigners, which, I mean, it's just, from everything I know, it's just fundamentally untrue. Because here's the thing that I think the Japanese government has to do going forward if it's going to continue justifying banning basically all foreigners from entering. They have to prove quantitatively that infection clusters and individual infections can be traced back to foreigners and foreigner communities, and specifically foreigners entering the country. Because if they can't, and I suspect they cannot, because after all, Japanese people are the ones flouting quarantine rules, then I think there's a very difficult case to be made for maintaining the travel ban. One of my favorite people I follow on Twitter, this infectious disease doctor out of UCSF in California, Dr. Monica Gandhi, she's fabulous. She was saying that travel bans imposed after a pandemic has started is like banning matches once the forest is ablaze in a forest fire. And it's really true. And I think in particular, I've said this in multiple videos with Japan, but I mean, Japan has basically had uncontrolled coronavirus spread since about last June or July. It's not as if they've taken an elimination approach like Taiwan or New Zealand or Australia, and there are flaws with those approaches. They're fundamentally unsustainable. But again, at least in those cases, you can understand why they would ban people. But in this case, there's no reason to ban people. There's no evidence that foreigners are spreading the virus at all, let alone more than Japanese people. And it's really troubling that this just goes uncontested. In Japanese political circles. It's really unfortunate. And I think the other issue that continues to trouble me, and I think rightly worries a lot of people about the travel ban and staying locked out, is this idea that it does seem like Japanese officials are sort of just running out the clock until the Olympics. Now, some of you who have already pushed off your studies until October, for example, or even next January, are saying, oh, well, that's not a big deal because I wasn't planning to enter until October or January anyway. And I can see why you would feel that way. But number one, I lived through a year of being gaslit by the Japanese government about restrictions would be eased once XYZ happens. And they finally did ease, of course, for 2.5 months before they were uneased again, diseased again. That's a weird pun. But I don't trust them as far as I can throw them. So I would say, number one, your optimism is misplaced there. Number two, I do think that given the circus surrounding the Olympics, the fact that they're not going to be forcing people to quarantine, and that a lot of the safety measures they put in place, or they say they're going to put in place, are essentially unenforceable. I mean, they're not going to be able to distinguish a Olympian who's walking around Tokyo where they're not supposed to be from a foreign resident unless they start carding people, which I think they could do, but I think it goes against a lot of the privacy concerns that Japan has had during the pandemic. I think it's almost guaranteed that the Olympics is going to be a super spreading event given the low level of vaccination among Japan's population and the fact that they're not requiring Olympians to be vaccinated as a condition of entry. And so I think the Olympics is going to be a super spreading event. And I think that it's going to take time then to contain that outbreak. So I think it will be lucky if by October things are even back to the point where the Japanese government can think about letting people in on a limited basis. Now, some of you say, Robert, in recent days, we've seen more and more talk about vaccine passports and government officials hinting that maybe foreigners will be able to use it too, because I'm sure you all will remember when Japan first started to entertain the idea of having a Japanese or a vaccine passport. It was not for reopening the borders to foreigners at all, be that to tourists, which I think ultimately the goal should be getting back to a full normality, or workers or students or romantic partners. No, it was so salarymen could go and travel abroad because, for some inexplicable reason, 95% of the countries in the world don't ban Japanese, even though Japan bans everyone, so that they could travel around the world unencumbered and not have to quarantine when they come back to their country. Now, there has been a suggestion in the Japanese media in recent days, I think in Nikkei and Asahi Shimbun and maybe in Japan Times even, basically stating that yes, we want to integrate our vaccine passport system with ones that the rest of the world is going to have, be that through the Comment Pass framework, IATA Travel Pass, so on and so forth. But even then, they have this monomaniacal focus on business travel. And granted, my Japanese skills are not that good still. I'm still Shokyu ni, so like beginner 2 class. I can barely speak the language. But this focus on business travel, unless it means something different in Japanese, unless it also means students and basically all non-tourist travel, this focus on restarting business travel, I mean, again, unless they're just talking about Japanese people being able to go overseas and do business travel there, I don't see how they can focus so much of their energy on this when, again, as I talked about in last month's video, at this point in the pandemic, with the powerful vaccines we have, and with many source markets to Japan, in particular the US and the UK, at or near herd immunity, we really need to stop talking about these half measures, about letting certain people in certain conditions for entry, and really moving back towards a full normal. Like, I'll give you a classic example. So South Korea, which has done better than Japan during this pandemic by basically every measure, is recently announced that they're reintroducing visas on arrival for people that hold the passports of 21 countries, including the US, the UK, and most of Europe. They have to fill out a small ETA, electronic travel authorization, online. And then South Korea has recently hinted, well, they've said that for their own residents coming back, those who have been fully vaccinated are not going to need to quarantine. But given that South Korea's border never fully closed, it is reasonable to assume that once the program is piloted, I guess, among local people and proven not to result in an increased importation of infections, that probably within the next 3 or 4 months, you'll be able to go to South Korea quarantine free, including as a tourist, if you are fully vaccinated. And that's magnificent. And, the unfortunate part about that, of course, though, and I don't mean this as any insult to those of you who have decided to go to South Korea to do your studies or to work, because, of course, that's totally sensible given how difficult Japan has made it this time. But I think the unfortunate part, and part of the reason Japan is able to keep dicking people over like this, is Japan is sort of like the fuckboy archetype, right? Like, it knows that it has something that many of us want and can't get anywhere else. And so it's going to treat us like shit a little bit, because it knows that to some extent, some of us are going to have to take this. Because for whatever reason, for educational reasons, for personal reasons, for professional reasons, we are so invested in the Japan brand that in the medium to long term, we don't really have any other choice. So, or the short to medium term, rather. But so Korea, I think, will be a pioneer in Asia to get this up and running, because, of course, the Asia Pacific region more broadly badly miscalculated on this pandemic. So, a pandemic is a marathon, not a sprint, right? And in 2020, a lot of Asia Pacific countries, with the exception of Japan, which had out of control spread most of that year, did very well in suppressing or eliminating the virus. But unfortunately, most Asia Pacific countries either didn't order enough vaccines or are not rolling them out expeditiously enough for them to have a significant impact for the rest of 2021, probably. And I think what we're realizing now, that the pandemic is sort of out of control in some parts of the world, coming under control in other parts of the world, that really there are two pieces. It's not only important that people who are coming in are vaccinated against SARS-CoV-2, so that their risk of importing and spreading the disease is much, much reduced, but the local population needs to have acquired some immunity as well, because God forbid an infection does get in somehow. Like a country like Australia, where I would assume probably less than 5% of people have antibodies, it would spread like wildfire, particularly if it was one of the variants, which I still believe are mostly a nothing burger. And I think people are falsely attributing out of control epidemics to them, when in actuality, it's much more simple than that. There's just viruses spread in places where people are not immune to them. That's the bottom line. And but anyway, Asian countries, including Japan, which I think at last check had vaccinated less than 2% of its population, they made a bad vaccine bet. And countries like the US and the UK, which got pilloried last year for apparently how horrible their responses were, I think are basically going to be back to normal within the next couple months. And of course, then there's the wonderful announcement that the US and the UK, and then the US and the EU, are going to be establishing reciprocal travel corridors for people who are vaccinated and who can produce negative COVID tests or show that they have antibodies. And that's fantastic. And it's such a breath of fresh air, I think, after a year of people having this false belief that we were going to get to this COVID zero utopia that, of course, is not attainable and ridiculous and requires unbearable short-term sacrifices for a goal that can never be realized. And it's just unfortunate that so much of Asia is so caught in the mindset that no risk is acceptable. I'm half betting that this travel bubble between Hong Kong and Singapore that's trying to launch for its third lucky time is going to burst before it finally does open, because someone's going to cough on either end of it. And then the travel bubble that Queen Jacinda has opened with Australia has already closed to Western Australia because they had 2 community cases. And I don't know. I hope that... I guess I just hope that if indeed South Korea, to go back to that, if they indeed do approach some sort of full border normality by the end of the summer, I hope, although given the 2 countries' history, I doubt Japan would want to do this solely because they wouldn't want to lose face to a country they perceive as being inferior. But I hope Japan would follow the South Korean model rather than the Australian or New Zealand model, because I think that as much as Japanese people might not want us here Miss Hashimoto and then the rest of them, or as much as some people might not think the contributions of foreigners don't matter, whether it is international education industry, whether it is workers that are doing jobs Japanese can't or won't, or skilled workers that are coming in because Japanese people didn't have enough babies decades ago, and the ones that they did maybe didn't study the right things and they just have a labor shortage, or whether it's the fact that that yes, the international tourism is a huge part of Japan's economy in a country with a shrinking population and one where the domestic market doesn't really pay that much per person per day. Japan made it through a year with closed borders, more or less. I mean, largely due to a lot of government programs and the fact that I think due to the debt to GDP ratio in this country, the average person doesn't even care about the national debt anymore. Japan cannot live through 2 years of closed borders. So I do think at some point in the third or fourth quarter of this year, or at the very latest in the first quarter of next year, by which point I think vaccines really will have tamped down the pandemic worldwide, with the exception of maybe a few hotspots. There will be a sea change at some point. I guess my fear right now, and the big point I'm trying to get to after rambling on for 16 minutes, I'm so sorry about that, is I think that it's going to take longer than we thought. Because again, naively in March and even in April, I thought that the start of the school year was going to cause Japanese officials to get some pep in their step. And as it turns out, that's not the case. They don't care about that. I think they're, as I said, they're trying to run the clock out before the Olympics. They're going to have the Olympics in whatever zombified form they have to have it. They're now saying there's not going to be Japanese fans either. And I think that the best case scenario, well, there's actually another best case scenario. I'm going to get to that. But barring the other thing I'm about to tell you about in like a minute or two, the best case scenario is that they do wait until after the Olympics to let people in, but that there's not a super spreading event and they open up in August or September. The worst case scenario is that there is a super spreading event, there's a massive fifth wave, and it's October, November, or December before they even think about opening up. Now, on the positive side, and I'm glad I could get to this because this has really been a dirgy, ranty video, there are a few campaigns on social media. So the Stranded Out JPN Twitter account, which is just fabulous and does so much great work, I can't fucking talk today, and brings so many important issues to light. They found out that there will be a G7 travel meeting soon. I say it soon, I hope it hasn't already passed because then I'm going to feel really stupid. But there's going to be a G7 meeting on, well, I guess on global affairs more broadly, but there's going to be an international travel portion of it. And a man in the UK named Grant Shapps, is going to be chairing that part of it. And his email is actually public. I don't know if it's still public because I imagine hundreds, if not thousands of students and workers have emailed him, but we're basically encouraging people to contact him and let him know exactly what's going on in Japan, why it's so unacceptable, and why he needs to bring this to the attention of Japanese authorities during that meeting. So that's really good. That's a great opportunity for everyone to get their voice directly heard, and for a G7 ally to kind of put Japan on the spot, because with the exception of Canada, Australia, is New Zealand G7? I don't know. But with the exception of Canada and Australia, certainly, the rest of the G7 is really starting to sort of get back to this idea of something approaching normal, US, UK, and the EU members of the G7. And I think that if there is pressure from the UK, which hopefully will be mirrored by pressure from EU countries in the US in that meeting, that might shame Japanese officials into changing their posture, regardless of what ends up transpiring with the Olympics. So that's pretty hopeful. A second thing that's taking place that I would say is somewhat less hopeful, because I think it worked in last August and September before variant mania took over the world. I don't think it's going to have the same effect now, is the media and corporate campaign. So there's a wonderful journalist called Karen Nishimura. She is a French-Japanese journalist. She's a very kind and funny and wonderful woman and very talented writer. And she has authored an article in, I think, the Yomiuri Shimbun. I can't remember which one it is. But where she basically takes up for us and said, oh no, it was Newsweek Japan, where she basically talks about how ridiculous it is that they're going to allow Olympians in without quarantine, but international students are still locked out. wonderful and compassionate person. And then, of course, Davide from Gogo Nihon is really pushing hard. He did a big LinkedIn post recently. He has his own YouTube channel, which is like a more G-rated, polite version of what I do, a little bit less ratchet. And again, he was so instrumental in getting the last ban pulled down, and my hat goes off to him. But I don't know that his sort of diplomatic, friendly, and for lack of a better word, Japanese approach is going to work. I think that when you have people that are doing you dirty, or a government that's doing you dirty, you sort of have to be a little bit of a street fighter. And that would be the other thing I would say. With regard to this Grant Shapps person, don't be an asshole. Don't be rude. Don't attack him. He's just the messenger. But be forceful. Let your pain be known. Let it be known how ridiculous it is that Japan keeps doing this. And I would say, I also extend this to when you're interacting with Japanese companies and brands on Twitter. One of the things I will never understand, well, actually, I do understand it now. So I think that the world has this concept of Japan as this like fundamentally competent country, which is part of the reason that even though Japan has the worst COVID outbreak in East Asia and the most uncontrolled one, very few Western media outlets ever call Japan's response into question, because there's just this presumption of competence, and I would argue almost superiority to some extent. And I even see it on people, for example, who interact with All Nippon Airways on Facebook and Twitter. Just, they post something the other day, "Oh, we can't wait to travel with you again." And they say, "Oh, I can't wait either, but I'm willing to wait as long as it takes for Japan to decide that it's safe for us," not knowing that Japan's response to COVID has been a dumpster fire. And again, I don't think you need to be as confrontational as maybe I am in some of my posts, but no, you need to say, okay, if you want to fly with us again, then pressure your government to reopen the border, pressure them to adopt the IATA travel pass, and to do it for general travelers and not just Japanese salarymen and business travel. Because again, the thing is, and I'm going on 25 minutes now, but until we get a broader reopening of travel, basically back to normal, even if that involves proof of vaccination in the beginning, there's not going to be a benefit to any economy around the world. And frankly, people are not going to feel confident to book travel, because they're going to know that they could be stranded overseas or locked out at the last minute. And, people who are not extremely committed, like I was back in December when I rushed in 4 days before everything closed, are not going to do that. But anyway, I've gone on long enough. I will include Grant Shapps' email in the description of this video. I probably won't give Miss Hashimoto any more oxygen, so I'm not going to link to her Twitter, but you can find her on Twitter if you haven't already been preemptively blocked by her. And I don't know, I wish this was a more hopeful video, but I have a terrible feeling that unless something comes of that G7 thing, that the best case scenario is getting in August or September after the Olympics are over. And I'm really sorry to say that. It sucks, but it is what it is. So I hope y'all are doing well. I hope in June I do have better news. For those of you who live in the US and UK and Israel and other countries that have done great with vaccinations, congratulations. Y'all are on your way back to normal, and that's fantastic. And I hope that you have a great, 2019 was or maybe it's 2018 was the hot girl summer. I hope you have a great shot girl summer. So I'll be back with you around the 1st of June. Okay, bye.